This is yet another recording on the channel, second video on this channel. Today's topic is sanctions. I will keep it short and quick and precise. I was thinking about it as issues that affects Africa and in a very, very significant way, which is sanctions. Sanctions are a tool that has been used by the West to punish African countries. That's what it is. If you think about it, sanctions are merely a tool which is used by those countries that are uh, powerful, economically, and even politically. In this case, we are talking about the Western countries, the European countries, and the United States of America. They impose sanctions on African countries, and not only African countries, and different countries as well in the Middle East, because these countries have resisted to do what the West want them to do. In for example, in Zimbabwe, when Robert Mugabe took back the land, they went on and imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe has resisted the colonial rule, because Robert Mugabe realized what was at play, that how can these people how can we fight and get our freedom back and still not get back our land? And Robert Mugabe realized he needs to take back the land. That became a punishable offense in the eyes of the Europeans and the Americans, because they want us to keep quiet and just let these people who took land during colonization to keep the land. So if you resist, you get punished by sanctions. But obviously, they will never come out straight and say we are imposing sanctions because these sovereign nations refuse to do our will. They will find something else to lie on. They will find something else to blame. Things such as human rights violations and all these things, so that it's justifiable for them to put those sanctions. But in if you look at it very well, these sanctions doesn't benefit anybody. In case of Zimbabwe, they were citing human rights violations, that the ruling party was violating the human rights of the citizens of Zimbabwe. But in the end, the sanctions made things even more difficult for those citizens that they are trying to protect. It does not make sense. The issue is just because they want us to do what they want. They wanted us to keep the colonial structures in place. They didn't want Robert Mugabe to take back the land. Henceforth, they ended up imposing these sanctions. I remember very well the opposition parties in Zimbabwe. They were calling for these sanctions. They were pushing for these sanctions. They were supporting these sanctions that they may be put in place. But in real life, these sanctions affect the people they claim to love, they claim to support, they ask support from. I do not understand whether it was pure ignorance or it's really that they were acting on behalf of the West. It does not make any sense. Why would anybody do that? In the end, we ended up where we are in Africa or in Zimbabwe because of these sanctions. And I'm sure there are so many other countries in Africa which go through this. There are people who are in these countries which claim to be opposition parties, which push for these sanctions to be put in place. It is said they are put in place against select people. It's only a select few which are on these sanctions, but in reality, it affects the whole country. I remember the conflict between China and America over Huawei. It clearly shows what the intentions were behind the American sanctions towards Huawei. It was simply because Huawei was taking over the market in America as well, above Apple. Then they realized they were losing the game. Then they used sanctions to manipulate, to The problem with the West, they claim to be the ones who set the standards of democracy, as if they themselves do not violate human rights. They violate human rights everywhere else. They are the ones who start wars everywhere else in the world. They are champions of violating human rights, but they want to make themselves as the Jesus or the gods of this planet and set standards of what democracy means to everybody else. Obviously, fair enough, they can put sanctions or quotas or whatever and say we don't want to trade or with country A or country B. It is up to them. But still, on the other hand, the question remains, who are you to tell us what democracy means? In as much we have, as much as we have issues in Africa of democracy, in as much as our democracy doesn't is not good for even for us as citizens, we still know we falling short on certain aspects of democracy. But the question still remains, who are you to come and tell us what democracy means when you yourself do not respect human rights across? In closing, I just want to say, if anybody in Africa, any black person in Africa, opposition parties in Africa, if anybody supports Western sanctions, please think twice. Please think twice. Is it because you think it's going to benefit you as an opposition party to get into power one day? Or you want to think about the well being of the citizens that you claim to represent? Let's stop listening to these people and supporting things that affects, that costs countries, that is costing our economies. Let's think for ourselves. If we want to be opposition parties, let's be opposition parties that stand on our own. Let's not be funded to try and dethrone a sitting government. In as much as these people, the leaders that we have so many issues, but that doesn't mean that you have to allow these people to bring in their propaganda and punish Africans and punish the people that you claim to represent.